how do you build successful companies? And we looked at all of these companies and attempted to determine what was their base of building. And we distinguished as a simple level the companies that were technology-based, that were more oriented towards being innovative, given your theme, from the companies that had essentially no technological base. And what we find is shown here, that of, well, let's see, of the 25,800 companies in the entire sample, those that were technology-based accounted for 2.8 million of the 3.3 million jobs and 1.7 trillion of the approximately 1.8 and a half trillion in global revenues. The non-technology-based companies, which were still surviving, accounted for very few jobs, relatively speaking, and very little of the overall revenues that had been created. So the percentages that came out of these different piles, in a sense, the technology companies versus the non-technology companies, really ended up where the technology companies accounted for 70 to 80% of the total impact of the firms. So here is the data on the median ages. For 50 years, the ages of entrepreneurs coming out of MIT at first startup has been gradually shrinking. Back in the 50s, the typical age was in the early 40s. It's gradually come down. By the 80s, it was in the 30s. If we take the blip activities of the 90s, you see it drop precipitously into the 20s as the average age of startups. Given enough time, that'll be corrected by the data. If we give those who graduated in the 90s enough time to have all of them who are going to become entrepreneurs show you their outputs, that will rise from above this number of 29. I'm sure that the average age after the fact of the graduates of the 90s will turn out to be something like perhaps 32 or 33 years of age at the time they started their first firm. But inevitably, the curve has been coming down. Now, as the curve of age comes down, the very important implication is so does the curve of experience. So it means that increasingly, people starting companies have less business experience than those who used to start companies. That provides a great opportunity for advisors, consultants, and maybe a really different opportunity for investors, because it says that investors had better have more complementary sets of skills to be able to assist startup entrepreneurs with information, insights, and substitute experience that the entrepreneur herself or himself is not bringing into the establishment from the beginning. So if you went back 50 years, somebody in their 40s has been working for 20 years in industry and has had an extensive amount of experience building career managerial judgment, understanding of competition, understanding of markets. But somebody in their 20s who maybe got out of school 2 or 3 years earlier has very little of that. And I would suggest, though we don't yet have the data, I would suggest that when we eventually get the data 10 or 15 years from now, we will find a considerably higher failure rate of the much younger entrepreneurs that are getting started today. So there is a temptation today to start companies quickly, but there's also an opportunity today to help those starting companies by providing to them perhaps the greater experience and wisdom that some of you in this audience may already have accumulated. In our data, 30% of all MIT foreign student alumni eventually become entrepreneurs. 20% of domestic alumni become entrepreneurs. That's a dramatic difference. And by the way, all of the senior people at MIT know these data. And I have attempted to publicize these data in the first presentation that I made of the study in 2009. That presentation was made in Washington in Congress. And as part of my testimony, I argued strongly against the stupidity of American visa policies and argued that the United States ought to have quick paths for all foreign students who come through accredited universities in science, technology, and management, and that they should be given automatic visa extensions right away. Apparently, the Congress of the United States doesn't understand self-interest enough to adopt the right kinds of visa structures and passport relationships that would really assist this country in its own economic growth and development. I thought I'd show you a few foreign students from MIT who some of you may very well know. I could have listed Desh Deshpande, but he's not an MIT graduate, so that wouldn't be good. But I did list Naren Patni. Naren was a student of mine when he was in the Sloan School. Naren stayed and started to work for Jay Forrester, who was my boss when he finished his master's degree at Sloan. Naren had a degree in electrical engineering, as I did, and from the Sloan School, as I did. And Naren began with his brothers to start an outsourcing company, perhaps the first or one of the first outsourcing companies in India. Naren was doing the selling in the United States, and his brothers were organizing and managing the software developers back in India. Over the entire life of Patni Systems, which in a way ended this past year when they sold the company, during that entire period of time, the US headquarters was located in Kendall Square in Cambridge. For most of the time, Naren's office was above the corner bank in the corner beside the Sloan School. When they finally got fancy, he moved across the street to One Broadway so that the office could be a little bit fancier as a public firm than the rather questionable offices he had in the bank. But the offices were split between Cambridge and Mumbai. And that was an intriguing kind of company with dual headquarters in two different parts of the world. I list Bob Wang. Bob Wang was a Taiwanese alumnus of MIT. Bob Wang started in California, a company called Synex. Synex became primarily an IT distributor. Synex now does $8 billion worth of revenue, public company, major firm, has been in business a very long period of time, and he has, again, MIT degrees after he got his prime education, his initial undergraduate education, back in his case, at Kyushu University in Japan as a Taiwanese citizen. I indicate Danny Lewin. Danny Lewin was an Israeli. Danny Lewin was the key technology guy for the founding of Akamai and created the technical base for building a company that is doing multi-billions of dollars in revenues today. Unfortunately, Danny was killed in 9/11. He was on one of the two planes from Boston that crashed into the World Trade Center and was killed in that case, but helped lay the foundation for building a great company, again, out of MIT. And the last one I state is Charles Zhang, who is my co-founder in forming Sohu.com in China. And Charles was a PhD in physics from MIT. He came to me during his year immediately after his degree and told me the amazing thing being, I want to go home to China. In 1996, very seldom did a Chinese graduate student say, I want to go home to China. Most of them said, is there any way you can get me into the Kennedy School so I can get a second degree? Or do you know any angles by which I can get a job for the World Bank or the IMF or the United Nations to stall from going home to China? But Charles wanted to go home to China, and Charles also wanted to start an internet company. And together, we co-founded Sohu.com, which is a public company. We have actually two companies in our group now. We spun off our gaming company, Changyou. Charles, Sohu is doing about $650 million in revenue and doing quite well. Now, if we attempted to list and identify all of the foreign student alumni from MIT who have built great companies, we would have a very impressive roll of companies that have contributed to this economy as well as to other economies, to this country's technology as well as other countries' technology. And I think that the story here is a very important story that really needs to be told by anyone who has an opportunity to convey that information. Let me go on and tell you another thing about entrepreneurs that we've learned. And that is, we've learned a lot about serial entrepreneurs. entrepreneurs who have started more than one company, and until now I've only been showing you data about those who've started their first company. Well, it turns out that when we look at 50 years of data coming out of MIT, we find that the trend toward becoming a serial entrepreneur has been very strong. And if we look over time, the bottom numbers here are showing you the percentage of those who were repeat or serial entrepreneurs. In the 1930s, a third of the MIT entrepreneurs were serial. That gradually climbs. By the 1970s, over half of the entrepreneurs coming out of MIT were forming, even by then, more than one company. The numbers start to decline, but they only decline because the people who graduated in the 80s and the 90s have had less of an opportunity to start their second and third and fourth companies. And I'm quite sure that the trend shown for the first 40 years, 50 years, is continuing. So I'm positive that if we eventually get enough data 20 years from now to see what happened with the graduates of the years 2000, we will find that 60 or 65% of all MIT alumni entrepreneurs have even by then started more than one company. Now, this is a very important thing. It's important phenomenologically. It's also important economically. On average, as I'll show you in the next slide, on average, the serial entrepreneurs are, first of all, different from the entrepreneurs who only eventually start one company. Serial entrepreneurs get started at a younger age than those who end up only starting one company. Why? Well, obviously, if by accident I start a company at a younger age, I've got more time, but that's not really a causal explanation. I think the cause is much more, that somebody inclined to become a serial entrepreneur has much more passion and drive from the get-go to get started on this pathway that they then intend somehow to repeat as they go forward in their lives. So not only are they younger when they first start entrepreneurship, they really have very different personal characteristics. Secondly, if you go from the first company they start to the second, from the second company to the third, the performance of those companies improves significantly. So the second company started, on average, is a higher performing company than the first. The third, on average, is higher performing than the second. Now, you all know lots of anecdotes where you know the exact opposite. Anecdotes don't answer the question. Gather sufficient data about the numbers, and you can begin to see what the overall trends are, and the statement of learning by an entrepreneur absolutely shows up in the data that you get successively increasing performance over time as you start and build more companies. The implications for the economy is dramatic because it says that each serial entrepreneur ends up contributing cumulatively far more jobs, far more economic contribution than does the solo entrepreneur. And on a personal basis, the serial entrepreneur becomes much more successful in terms of wealth accumulation and the like. So you end up with, within the body of entrepreneurs, different classes of entrepreneurial individuals. Those who may succeed with their first and only company, and great, good luck to them if they can do that, and those who, in a sense, make a life's career of starting and building companies, in which they've given themselves many more opportunities over time to do that to the world and to personally benefit in the process of doing it. Let me now talk about one more topic. And I was talking to one of my former MIT students before in the lobby about this, and he remembered hearing me mention this at an earlier conference someplace. And that is that our data are very clear. There is a mythology about entrepreneurs that's especially true in the United States. That is, mythology especially true. And the mythology is that entrepreneurship is an individual game of individuals who do great things. The data prove that that mythology is bull. Entrepreneurship is a team game, not a solo individual game. On average, solo entrepreneurs fail. The data are so clear that if you look at the differences between those who started a company by themselves, those who started it with a partner, those who started it with 2 partners, those who started it with 3 partners, and just look at the array of performance, failure rate, or what have you, the story is clear. The increased number of team members in a founding team correlates dramatically with the increased probability of developing a successful company. Now, in particular, if as part of your team you manage to escape from having only a cluster of nerds, and you manage, Bob Metcalf, who is a great MIT alum, says that one of the wonderful things about MIT is that it has both the nerds and the suits. Those are his expressions. If you have an opportunity of balancing your team between technical people and at least someone from a background in marketing and sales, and even possibly someone from finance. By the way, the data is not so strong on the finance side, but there's data there. You have to watch out for those finance guys. You end up with a considerably greater likelihood that you will be able to build a successful organization. So teams succeed, not individuals. And again, I know plenty of individuals who've succeeded, so I know that we can all tell the anecdotal stories about the great individuals who succeeded, but there are actually relatively few of the ones that you know about where you could tell such stories. Apple was not started by an individual, it was started by 2 people. Microsoft was not started by an individual, it was started by 2 people. Desh Deshpande's companies were not started by Desh, they were started by Desh and partners. If you go look even at Facebook, even in the movie, you find that Mark Zuckerberg was not alone in starting Facebook. So it turns out that even the great stories about successful entrepreneurs are usually stories that talk about the leader who became a great person over time, not just who was the founder. And you find that in most cases, the founding team consisted of more than one individual.